Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nina, and everybody at SICE and MSI Integrity for putting on the panel. What I'll do in the interest of time is briefly introduce our panelists and the topics and turn it over to them each for 4 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So this is an interesting panel because for everybody at this table, it gives you a window of insight into the last 20 years of our lives, for better or worse. And in this case, I mean, it's a great opportunity to actually take stock of what it's meant. So today's panel will start with Virginia Hafler, who's going to provide some context to the discussion and who's at the University of Maryland teaching this and many other issues. And then we're going to turn it over to Brian from the AFL-CIO, because I think one thing that needs to be highlighted in a lot of the discussions about MSIs is the union perspective, because in the mid and late 90s when all this started, it was and still is a very critical perspective. Then we'll turn it over to Amal, because now ICAR, the organization he runs, is really about the next generation of standards and how do you turn a lot of this into law or regulation. And then finally, I'll turn it over to Meg, who has been enmeshed in the middle of many MSIs and still is, and has some very unique perspectives. And then finally, Bennett, because he has seen this both from an NGO, a government, and a private sector perspective as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Virginia for our first topic, which is really to take stock of what the last couple of decades have looked like.
Thank you, and I want to thank MSI Integrity and the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School for putting together this panel and the MSI Integrity tool. I also want to personally thank Ben, where'd he go? Right here. He's the one who asked me to participate in this, and he also asked me a couple of years ago to participate in a workshop that led to some of their initial thinking and mapping out of the terrain of MSIs. And I just want to say it was Ben ran a very effective and informative workshop and consultation that demonstrates the thoroughness with which they have gone through a process to produce this instrument, and it's quite impressive. So what are MSIs? They are rules and standards addressing a particular problem through dialogue and negotiation among a variety of different actors: business, government, international organizations, and nonprofits. There is no well-accepted single definition, but that's sort of ultimately sort of a baseline from which we can work. These governance initiatives do things like establish and negotiate rules and standards. They can implement them. They can finance them. They can set an agenda, monitor and enforce the particular rules they institutionalize. They can range from very, very sort of soft and sort of statements of principle all the way to something that's more like a formal intergovernmental organization with a lot more oomph to it. So they are institutionalized to different degrees, and part of what the MSI Integrity tool gets at is some of that variation. They can be voluntary, but not all of them are. They often are rooted in or supported by government regulation. So they have sort of a mix of voluntary and regulatory aspects to them. In some cases, not all of them do that. So there's a wide variety that we see out there. When we use that term MSI, people might be talking about different things when they refer to them. MSIs began to emerge back in the 1970s and 80s, and a lot of people don't realize that. They have soared in number throughout the 1990s and into the last decade or so, but many people identify a slowdown in recent years. I'm not sure there is, because it's very difficult to collect data on MSIs, partly because of these various definitions. They emerged when globalization appeared to be plowing forward inevitably, leading to the construction of vast networks of corporations spanning the globe, crossing boundaries, embedding companies in these networks that kind of obscure the conditions of production on the ground in various places around the world, places that have very different standards, norms, and regulatory systems. They also emerged as governments failed. They failed to reach agreement on ways to regulate corporations, or they tried and failed with different kinds of foreign policy, most notably things like sanctions, which did not have the impact that governments had hoped. They emerged as globalization also empowered activists who acquired more ability to investigate and bring a spotlight to the deficiencies of governance in a lot of places in the world and the complicity or potential complicity of corporations. Today, what we see is those different groups have come together oftentimes with MSIs as kind of a default position when there's a problem that crosses these different boundaries where we don't have a lot of governance or it isn't strong enough. And when they're looking for sort of pragmatic, what is one way we can take action? MSIs try to be inclusive in ways that often governments are not. And they also try to be less intrusive in some ways than governments, thereby sort of finding some kind of medium ground between business, government, and activists. Not always getting that balance very well. The current situation, and here I'm going to draw on some research primarily by a colleague of mine, Oliver Westerwinter, and others, who Oliver collected, with my help I should say, a data set of MSIs, again, kind of not necessarily representative sample, but it's a lot of them, so it's better than a lot of other data sets out there. And he identified over the course of decades an increase of 500% more or less of MSIs, and identified over 400 of them that exist today. They're not distributed evenly across issue areas, and that is one of the most striking results of the analysis of this data. There are a lot of them for environment and development, and very few, relatively speaking, that are specifically oriented to human rights. They are not, the participation in them is not evenly distributed in terms of things like industry. So we have a lot for things like agriculture, forestry, mining, energy, and some consumer goods, but very few for, say, the financial sector. So we see a real unevenness in industry participation. We also see unevenness in government participation in the MSIs that include governments. Individual states often do not participate in bunches of MSIs. There are a few select really big ones that get a lot of attention, and the rest, it might be one government here or there. So it's very unevenly distributed in terms of government participation also. In most cases, the type or design or institutionalization that you see of a particular MSI reflects something about the pre-existing institutions in that area, areas that might already have a lot of activity by international organizations or government regulations or other things going on. So the variety you see in the character of MSIs in part reflects these differences. Within issue areas, over time, we now have actual time that we can look at, a cycle of what we see. In the particular area that I'm looking at right now, which is conflict minerals, we see the failure of government sanctions, which led in part to the construction of one of the most prominent MSIs, the Kimberley process for a certification scheme for rough diamonds. But that model then wasn't necessarily followed for other similar conflict minerals. Instead, we see a variety of things happening with much weaker standards. We see the emergence of MSI initiatives on a regional level or through the OECD, but we also see the re-entry of governments. The US passed legislation, which will go away soon. The EU passed legislation just recently. We may, I think we're seeing some in Canada. So we see this cycle in which states fail, MSIs are created, states re-enter, and this is not just unique to the conflict minerals issue area. There are now multiple MSIs, and one of the biggest questions we all have is how they relate to each other. Do they compete? Do they substitute for each other? Do they substitute for government regulation? Do they undermine each other? Do they drive competitively standards up or down? And this is an area where I think we don't have good answers. Decades of experience do demonstrate that MSIs vary in how much they change over time, with rigidity and sort of a status quo thinking in some MSIs ultimately undermining them as the environment around them, the political environment, the normative environment changes. So that's sort of a brief overview of where we are today. And I think the rest of the panelists are going to bring you up to date on exactly what's happening now, which I'll be very interested to hear.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Brian to give his perspectives.
Thanks very much, Arvin. And thanks, Ben and Madeline, and also Amelia, who's not here with us today. My introduction to MSI Integrity was meeting Amelia at, I think, the first or second ICAR meeting I went to. And it was when she described this project, I thought, this is absolutely necessary. I was really hopeful, and I still think it's absolutely necessary. It's beginning, and as will become clear from my comments, from the labor perspective, and not just the AFL, I think I can speak with the global unions on a lot of these issues. We really think that this project may be important, but it must be revised with some specifics that we can talk about later. Basically, and I also did participate in a couple of the meeting at the Dutch Embassy, an EITI workshop on the possibility of getting a grievance mechanism. So I've been involved a few points along the way. But I think I should just be very clear that our position, sort of hinted by Arvind, is, and it's supported by our global partners in labor, by our national unions, by lots of local unions, and it's reflected in this report. I brought 10 or 12 copies with me, and this is from 2013, so I have some copies for those people who didn't hear it. It's called Responsibility Outsourced, and it's a real examination of a few MSIs in the labor sector. So, that's our position. I won't go into a lot of details for the purpose of time. This came out, incidentally, it was released the day before the Rana Plaza disaster. So there was a lot of interest. We've reprinted it a few times based on the interest. And it remains our position. I would say that both the FLA and the SAI have changed some things about the way they operate. These are not stagnant. They do evolve. They do listen. They do change. But our position basically hasn't changed on those. We find that they consistently have failed, not just those two, but the MSI as a solution for a governance gap has really failed to protect human rights at work or to command respect for them. And they remain mostly corporate-led from our perspective, and they don't lead to remedy, just like the UNGPs. The first two pillars, I think people can claim some serious work and progress, but we almost never see remedy. And I would just put a parenthesis in there and say, unfortunately, I would say the same thing about the other things that we've seen with globalization, whether we're talking about trade agreements, whether we're talking about things like the OECD guidelines. None of these have actually really delivered much in the way of remedy. They think a lot of knowledge and some improvement on issues, but as far as getting to remedy, I think we can confidently say there's been a real problem in that. As Arvin hinted, the U.S. unions, our affiliates in the AFL-CIO itself, definitely participated in a moment in the 1990s, especially in garment with the Apparel Industry Partnership. I think there was hope of a negotiation of something. And I have to say, I would like to interrogate a bit the word that we throw around a lot about voluntary. Because I think it's perfectly good and fine for the process to be voluntary. Social dialogue, as the ILO puts it, the ILO calls collective bargaining by necessity free and voluntary. But it must lead to an agreement that is enforceable. And this is where we hit a problem with pretty much all the MSIs we've interacted with, never getting to that. I think the unions in Europe, because of a more robust tradition of social dialogue and actual delivery on that and just an everyday practice and acceptance of it, they were much slower to sort of let go of participation in a lot of MSIs. They stayed at the table a lot longer, but eventually they too have left a lot of them, and I think that's true for the most part. As we're thinking about this, not just for this panel, but anytime I think about it, I always end up thinking of the A.O. Hirschman book on exit, voice, and loyalty, and about reactions to feeling included, not including, getting your voice heard, deciding you're going to raise your voice, deciding you're going to leave. And I think, the process that was entered into voluntarily by government, industry, and at that time, U.S. labor was, there's something, globalization, there's sweatshops, we want to do something, but eventually and the position remains, as far as actually sitting on some of these MSIs, we don't do very much of it because we feel there's nothing at stake because it never gets to an enforceable agreement. But again, this is a voluntary process to getting to one, but getting to one, and I'll talk later about ones that are. I think that the aspect of these MSIs, it's sort of, I talk to people about it, it's a hall of mirrors for a lot of unions, and certainly for unions that don't have a lot of resources. They may have language challenges, they may have not just money, but the ability to be present. It takes a lot of time to interact with one of these MSIs on organizations that are already beat down by so many other things. Mm-hmm. It's really time-consuming, it's unwelcoming, and there's virtually nothing at stake in most cases. You may get some improvements. You'll almost never get remedy for the affected communities or the workers if we're talking about that. So if an MSI, from our way of thinking, doesn't have an exit, if it doesn't lead to a place where, okay, the parties didn't reach agreement in this nice structure we have, let's go to arbitration. Let's go to something where we can get an answer that's not dominated by the usually corporate-led governance and structures. So that's sort of what our position is, reflected in some case studies from here. I think that another thing that happens through some MSIs and some business and human rights programs is levels of co-optation of communities, co-optation of unions, because they do feel like they're being heard, and then they lose credibility with their own members or the community. So it has a lot of costs, and I don't only mean financial, for organizations. Some of our partners have been unwilling to challenge a company that is certified through an MSI because they think it'll have an impact on employment, and it very well might. So by initiating something, they may be ending jobs because a company might lose a certification. And it also stops a lot of organizations from using the law because they think, I've got this other thing. If I use this light touch, maybe I won't have to use the heavy touch, and they delay, and sometimes a statute of limitations passes or whatever. So I think another point that was made I would reinforce is the MSIs are really not defined. It's poorly defined. What does it mean? SOMO, the Dutch NGO, did a big report on MSIs, and they had a sort of hilariously circular definition of what one was. It was saying that these are initiatives that have various stakeholders. That's really all they did was sort of break down the acronym. And I think it's incredibly flexible what you mean when you say an MSI. I've actually had some debates with people from organizations that we're very close to, and I think some of them say, we're not an MSI, don't call us an MSI, thinking of the Workers' Rights Consortium. And I understand completely what they're saying, but by some definitions, they are. The difference is they get to an agreement and they go for enforcement. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, I think they told me before in the past that they were comfortable with being called one, but you had to say a worker-driven or worker-centered MSI, and you had to get to enforceability. So the definition is totally unclear, and it's mushrooming, and maybe it's not, according to the professor, but it seems like they're growing a lot. So I think that we need to interrogate this. It seems like they'll continue, and there's a lot of good intentions and probably some improvements in some areas, but I would say that in the one area that we find consistent, really difficulty, is on freedom of association, because it's so poorly understood by some of the people who are working in some of the MSIs. And I think that the other problem with most MSIs is, behind it all, is this huge social audit industry that has grown incredibly. And there's something that some of you probably know about the Global Social Compliance Program, where the companies are all getting together, all the biggest global companies, and saying, okay, looks like we're never going to get government enforcement. Let's privatize the whole thing, but let's not spend so much money on it. Let's have recognition of certain social audits and codes. So we're talking about giving up on a government function of inspection or of rights compliance and privatizing it, but in a corporate-led system, because that global social compliance is not an MSI. What these things tend to lack for us is any analysis of the power relationships between buying companies and suppliers, dependence of the suppliers on the power and the money of the buyer, and the need to change some practices and recognize that they could do some things differently. And also, obviously, going to freedom of association, a reluctance to frankly discuss and perhaps change the power relationships between workers and employers. So I think, some of our partners in some places, and certainly some communities and some NGOs and some good allies stay involved in MSIs And I think most people stay in, most organizations stay in, hoping that eventually it will yield a result. And I think a lot of unions have tried that for 5 or 6 years back in previous years and then left, and some of our NGO allies have done that. They worked at it for a few years and then just said, there's nothing at stake here. So that's what's happened so far from our perspective. I didn't go into details. I have some of these reports. I just want to try not to talk too much longer, so I'd like to leave it at that for this first chunk. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Almal to follow.
Sure. Okay, great. So let me say, I am more glass half full about MSIs. I think really I think the problem with MSIs is that we think of them as an end result instead of as a process. And in doing so, we actually, I think, harm our abilities to achieve anything. So essentially, an MSI, in my opinion, in our opinion at ICAR, we serve on the board of the International Code of Conduct on Private Security Providers, which deals with private security contractor accountability. And we're also a member of the Fair Labor Association just recently. For us, there's sort of three components of why an MSI comes together. First is about a set of standards that are agreed upon by various sets of stakeholders. The second is some process of monitoring or assessment of company compliance or compliance to those standards. And then the third piece is really, I think, the piece that is the weakest across MSIs is some sort of redress or grievance mechanism to alert and to provide some remedy in case a company is found to be non-compliant with a particular standard that the MSI is holding up. I think what happens in MSIs is we have put too much into them. I think focusing on these three broad areas in one initiative is really difficult. I also think we've adopted a sort of a critique of MSIs that doesn't take into account the difference in certain sectors. So let me tell you when it comes to private security contractor accountability, this is not a this notion of governance challenges or governance gaps is also just code name for a failure of government to regulate. So let's just call it what it is. Where governments are unwilling to regulate due to corporate influence or a complete offshoring of public functions like private security, what do we have in front of us? We have no viable path forward in terms of regulatory potential. So then enter the MSI. And there, due to a sort of combination of political factors, of consumer pressure, of sort of legal challenge, there was this sort of moment where the Code of Conduct came together. It was around after Nisour Square and all this attention being placed on private security contractors. There, it is hard for me to say that the initiative has not proven useful. We have over 150 private security providers, Meg probably knows the number more accurately, that are companies that never really thought about human rights. In fact, in some of my initial discussions with them, they would offhandedly say that when they ran over people in Iraq, what they would do is pull the car over and hand the family that was standing over a dead child's body a wad of cash and continue to drive away. So this is a system of completely unregulated corporate activity. And so there, I do think that there is value in having dialogue and getting companies to implement standards around human rights. Again, I think my perspective is that we put too much into MSIs. If we do believe that MSIs are also going to be a tool for community involvement, worker voice, and some sort of grievance, I wonder if we're putting too much into that process. For me, an MSI structurally is very difficult for a community member or workers group to access. For instance, as I sat on the board of the ICOCA, we're developing certification schemes. We're developing monitoring process. We had initially some members of community-based groups serving on the steering committee. It's next to impossible to have a conversation about what global certification would look like and the challenges to it in an English language process from a French-based, African-based NGO that works on specific sort of engagement with communities on the ground. I'm not saying that voice is not important to the dialogue. I just think we put it in the wrong part of the process. And I think we have to have an honest conversation about that if we're thinking about MSIs. So again, for me, look, I think that there are certain sectors where MSIs are more challenging. But I do think that in some sectors and around some issues, MSIs serve a vital contribution to the business and human rights and corporate accountability space even if it's just a means of having a conversation with a broad set of the industry.
Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Meg to follow up on what some of them all said as well.
It's fine. Can I use it? Great. Thank you. So as was mentioned, I have the battle scars of being involved in either the formation or the ongoing governance of a number of initiatives. So I'm speaking really from that perspective. And I've been involved in 3 accountability-oriented and 1 principles-based initiative. So the Fair Labor Association, the Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers, which we call ICOCA, the Global Network Initiative, and then the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And so I just offer a couple of observations. I'm also glass half full person, despite the battle scars of decades, really, of involvement in this. I would say that though imperfect, these initiatives really are a critical piece of a much bigger business and human rights ecosystem. Without them, what we would have is a world of competing and conflicting, largely company and industry association-driven efforts on one hand, and campaigning on the other. So no common standards, no coordination regarding monitoring and remediation, and instead of arriving at a level playing field or some kind of basic consensus view on what is required, we'd be faced with lowest common denominator efforts and fighting over that. As Mauls said, these initiatives are addressing gaps, and he's nailed it. Governments are failing to regulate. They're either incapable or unwilling to regulate. In the private security industry, those companies were used in much greater degree after 9/11. There was an explosion in their use, and particularly the US and the UK had no existing structures to regulate, but also because they were both client and regulator in a very difficult position. So there were efforts by a Mauls group and other groups to try to fill jurisdictional gaps and nibble around the edges that went nowhere. The industry created a standard. It had no credibility, the association as well. Even the UN attempted to create a convention that also failed. Just yesterday, we kind of got a reminder of just how hard accountability is in this sector when an appellate court in Virginia, in Alexandria, ruled on a procedural motion involving the liability of a US contractor for torture at a prison facility they operated in Abu Ghraib. This was a procedural decision at the appellate level, but it enables the case to go forward. It's taken 10 years to get to that point. We're still talking about, this ruling essentially said, these people were tortured, this contractor is liable, let the case proceed. That's a really long time to wait. And I'm not suggesting that all of these aren't part of a bigger strategy, just that remedies are long to find in these other places. This also gets at another point, which is that where governments are unable or unwilling to regulate, they at least have an obligation to use their purchasing power to try to encourage companies to participate in these voluntary mechanisms. So in the COCA, we have tirelessly urged governments, including our own, to tie procurement eligibility to membership in these organizations, because we've learned, and a lot of the work that ICAR has done documents how clunky procurement systems are, and governments rely on these contractors, so cutting them off is often not an option. But at least if they're part of an initiative with standards, monitoring, and some effort at remediation, you have some additional supplemental oversight of them. The Global Network Initiative responds to a different problem. It's not the failure of government to regulate, but government as an active player in forcing companies to abrogate the rights of their users through requests to censor or surveil their users. So in that case, and Shelley Khan is here, Shelley worked tirelessly within the Congress on the Global Online Freedom Act to work on companies' role in that process and some reporting requirements. And one version of that law recognized that companies that were members of the GNI would either be subject to lighter reporting or be exempt from reporting because they were part of an initiative that was working to address those concerns. I would just say as well that in the context of the FLA, the university members require their licensees to be a member of the organization as a way to guarantee that they are complying with labor standards. So the second point that I wanted to make was that MSIs are not static. they evolve over time, both to expand their membership beyond the original group, which can include other industry sectors, but also to update and strengthen both their standards and their accountability processes. And in my mind, at least as to the accountability-oriented initiatives I'm involved in, this really shows the value of this kind of a structure as compared to, say, the Kimberley process that was mentioned, where you've got a government-led process that could not adjust their definition of conflict minerals to address the situation in Zimbabwe, for example. In the Fair Labor Association, during my time there, we have undertaken a number of changes to the process, amendments to the code and the benchmarks regarding labor rights issues, principles of responsible sourcing. It was mentioned that there's an interrelationship between what brands want and what suppliers can deliver, and often those interrelationships are fraught and then drive labor violations at the bottom of the supply chain. So those principles were addressed to exactly that dilemma and also included a fair compensation element. In addition, there were extensive reforms to the third-party complaint process, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Within the Global Network Initiative, by far the most major change was bringing in the telecommunications companies. And this was a game changer. There was a multi-year process of dialogue to better understand the industry and adapt what were policies for the internet companies to a very different industry, and also to adjust the accountability framework to that industry model. But what was also interesting is in so doing, it became far more relevant and far more interesting for Global South civil society to engage, because many of the concerns they had really emanated from a lot of the relationships between telcos and their own governments. The last point that I want to make is multi-stakeholder initiatives have footprints and impacts that go beyond the narrow circle of board membership. This was mentioned earlier. We kind of get very focused on who's sitting at the governing table and what sort of the four corners are of that. But in fact, MSIs regularly engage with companies outside the tent and other stakeholders outside their membership, both to advance their broader goals of leveling the playing field, but also promoting respect for rights. And I wanted to give a couple of examples of that. Within the Fair Labor Association, in the 2017 annual report, for example, there's discussion of a roundtable that was held with 35 Indian civil society members to address gaps in child labor protections in Indian law. There's also a project to empower women in the Nestle cocoa supply chain in Cote d'Ivoire that involved a partnership with Oxfam and also with women's groups on the ground. And this has now been expanded to include additional communities. I mentioned earlier that within the FLA's process is a grievance mechanism that has been adapted. In 2016 alone, 20,000 workers' issues were addressed through 9 separate investigations. It involved issues of pay and termination systems, freedom of association issues, and reinstatement issues. And we can talk more about that later. But within the Global Network Initiative, there's been ongoing policy advocacy and also collaboration with outside stakeholders from the Freedom Online Coalition, which is really a coalition of governments, but also outside stakeholders, through to the UN Special Representatives and Rapporteurs, and then RightsCon, the annual conference that brings together a wide range of civil society. As Amal mentioned, within the ICOCA, we have been going out in the field to pilot a monitoring program. We've been in Nigeria, Kenya, and most recently Iraq. And in each of those, we've reached out to civil society networks, both to explain what we are trying to do and to engage them, because they are our eyes and ears on the ground, but we also want them to be highlighting for us problems that arise so we can try to work to address them. Because as Amal mentioned, the understanding of many of these companies about the impact they were having and their responsibilities to address it was, charitably put, primitive at best. And so those field-based visits engage companies that may or may not be members, but also civil society organizations, many of whom have started to join us. And we're starting to create a network for both to start to dialogue around the challenges that they face and how we can work to help address them. So I'll leave it at there for the first round.
Well, thank you, and finally, I'll turn it over to Bennett for his multifaceted perspective. on the issue.
Multifaceted. I guess it is multifaceted, and it certainly is based on, what, about 2 decades? I mean, we weren't kidding when we said it was almost 20 years ago today that somebody taught the band to play. I mean, it was early '99 in my case when I got to state DRL, and I remember meeting Virginia Haufler that spring of '99 to get her advice about how to move forward in this area around extractives. And it was, I think, later in the spring of '99 that a young kid with long hair and a backpack would start showing up at my office at DRL, Arvind Ganeshan from Human Rights Watch, to help me lay the basis for what became the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And in my case, also '99, when I was an ex officio representing state on the board of the FLA in its real nascent period, just after the unions had really jumped ship, which was unfortunate at the time and ever since. So we really are 2 decades in. I mean, Virginia goes back to references in the 70s and 80s, but it really is the mid to late 90s when we got going with MSIs in the human rights space. So my perspective is informed a little bit by the FLA, but mostly my involvement with the voluntary principles in launching, developing and launching it, and then being on the board of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative for a number of years, and being a co-founder with Arvind and board member with him and Meg of the Global Network Initiative, which I'm still involved with on a virtually daily basis. So my view is that, and I'll just state my thesis right at the top and then try to explain it for a few minutes. My view is that while these MSIs remain works in progress, and while they have had, each one of them, I think it's fair to say, mixed records of demonstrable pluses and minuses in each of them. Nonetheless, overall, I think they have made significant, in some cases, very significant, net overall positive contributions to the cause of corporate accountability and human rights. And I would go further and I'd argue that while they have diminished in the space they take up in the overall landscape of business and human rights, because the field has expanded so much, they're actually more relevant and I'd say even more important than ever. And I'll end in a few minutes by explaining that point, amplifying that point in particular, why I think they're more relevant and important than ever. First on impact, and I really want to salute MSI Integrity and my friends Madeline and Ben and Tyler and Amelia and the others. And I go back to the beginning, I think, with you guys as well over half a dozen years ago. And you've really provided a vital service in giving us a tool for trying to analyze the construction and composition of these MSIs, but also their content and impact. And I think we all struggle with evaluating impact. And even if we accept the proposition that each are incomplete works in progress, it's hard sometimes to see the impact. One of the reasons it's difficult is that there are varying degrees of transparency and reporting on the part of the MSIs themselves. Another reason is that the nature of some of the MSIs, the focus of their work, makes it very difficult to actually measure that impact. As difficult as it is, for example, to measure the impact of the FLA and, for that matter, the ETI and some of the other efforts working on factory labor issues, it's easier than measuring the impact, say, of the voluntary principles in security and human rights, which deal with even more opaque security arrangements with public and private security forces around the world. There's a basic methodological challenge always of trying to hear and decipher the dog that doesn't bark. And in the case of the voluntary principles, my view and the view of, I think, many others who've been far more involved with it, particularly operationally on the ground, than I have been in some years, think that it's saving lives and protecting rights 24/7 in several dozen countries, and yet the empirical analytical work really hasn't been done to demonstrate that. And when someone gets around to doing it, it'll still pose very difficult methodological problems. But I really think that each one of these MSIs, we've mentioned the voluntary principles, ICOCA, which is the youngest. We've mentioned ETI, EITI, which isn't really fundamentally about human rights. It's about governance and corruption around natural resources, but it has huge collateral implications for human rights. We've mentioned GNI and the FLA. Each one of them, I think, has made very positive, tangible contributions. And I'm not going to, at this round at least, offer those examples. I could give a dozen examples for each one of them. Probably fewer for ICOCA because I'm less familiar with it and it's younger. By the way, in terms of the point that Amal made, I think, about the competition among some of them, I really would like to see greater cooperation and ultimately possibly even a merger between the voluntary principles and ICOCA, since they pretty obviously address two sides of the same coin, the private security side and then the extractives companies dealing with both private security and public security. The other point I want to make, though, before getting on to my main contention about greater relevance than ever, is that there have been weaknesses, both in the original design, but also the continuing governance and conduct of each of the MSIs to varying extents. None represents perfect architecture, although I would say that Arvind and I and several others worked very hard in constructing the governance approach and particularly the accountability approach of GNI to absorb and apply the lessons we learned the hard way, directly or indirectly, from the FLA, the voluntary principles, EITIs. So GNI, in its construction of 2006 to 8, and then the governance charter and the assessment template process in 2009, in many ways, I think, embodied a stock taking that was quite constructive at that point. Similarly, ICOCA, I think, has drawn on, again, I'm much less familiar with it, but has drawn on lessons from all the above, not least the voluntary principles. One of the problems, though, that the MSIs still face, each of them to varying degrees. And I'm not going to get into the particulars of my critique of any one of them, but I think it's fair to say that just as one says that the United Nations is only as effective as its member states allow it to be, through the perm reps on the Security Council, the General Assembly, and elsewhere, so I think it's fair to say that MSIs are effective only to the extent that their multi-stakeholder members allow them to be, particularly the companies, but not least the NGOs, and when there are governments at the table, the governments. GNI is a bit of an anomaly because it's got investors and academics in addition to NGOs. It also doesn't have governments. But I would make the rather critical observation, without apologies, but without blame, that in my experience with a number of these, that there has been inconsistent and inadequate attention, commitment, and engagement on the part of some of the key actors. Some of the companies don't take them seriously enough. Some of them use them as, at best, insurance policies, at worst, PR fronts. And I just will say it publicly on one of them that's least related to EIT, to human rights, and that's EITI, because I'm on the record with an open public letter, a signatory to that letter last week, calling on the board to remove or at least suspend Chevron and Exxon because of their efforts to take the U.S. out of EITIs, implementing as well as supporting government in the process with the support of the current administration. So there are real questions about commitments of some of the companies, and I think that that's been a problem more with the voluntary principles and EITI than it's been with the FLA or certainly with GNI. There's also been a problem, in my view, with focus and commitment on the part of NGOs. And I think the NGOs have been all across the spectrum of commitment and focus and really using these MSIs. Some have engaged only casually and intermittently. Some have engaged deeply and intensively and forcefully. And I wish that there was greater consistency in the degree of focus and the commitment on the part of NGIs. I can tell you in my own case, I was very personally motivated to work with Arvind and others in putting together the voluntary principles back in 2000, not only to serve U.S. foreign policy, national security, and energy security, as well as human rights interests at the time, but also to create a global baseline standard for NGOs to use to hold companies accountable. And I've, over the years, at times been disappointed in the focus and willingness and consistency of NGOs to use that standard in particular. Another quick observation that I'll just wrap up here with why I think it's more relevant than ever. These MSIs are hard work, and ultimately they depend on trust. And there's a whole spectrum of them, of low trust to high trust. The EITI now is descending into low trust for the reason I mentioned. The voluntary principles were at the lowest depth of distrust imaginable 10, 12 years ago, and I think they've come back up. They still have a ways to go. GNI, in my experience, has been remarkably and consistently pretty high trust. Sometimes I worry that we sing Kumbaya together too often, and occasionally I want to put, one of my old favorite Clash albums on the turntable to remind myself that we can't, or at least shouldn't be agreeing on everything. But at the end of the day, there's a basis of trust. So let me make my final point. These MSIs, however incomplete, however inadequate, they are, whatever their problems have been, in my view, are more important than ever. And they're particularly more important than ever in the United States, particularly more important for U.S. companies. And the reason is that given the administration we have now and the Congress we have now, it is a fantasy, it is a fallacy to think that we're going to have any positive initiative anytime soon in anything having to do with corporate accountability or human rights for that matter across the board. There's a war going on right now. We're on defense. We've got to hold on to the standards that we've got. The FLA, the voluntary principles, ICOCA, these are precious more than ever now to stand up for, to defend, to build, to renovate, to improve. We've got standards and initiatives in other jurisdictions, God bless them. The Australians are moving forward with their version of a modern slavery act, following the Brits, following California. We're just not going to see that kind of initiative here in the U.S. until we change the Congress, till we change the White House. So look, MSIs are loom less large than they did 15 years or so ago, but they need to loom a little larger the next half dozen plus years until we have a better balance among governments, international institutions, multinational corporations, NGOs, civil society, local communities. We need these standards, and I'm not giving up on legislation, not giving up on regulation, certainly not giving up on prosecution. We need all of that. We can't do governance without government, but we're not going to have the U.S. government on our side for the next few years. Thank God we've got DRL still holding the flag valiantly, keeping all this going to the extent they can, but these MSIs are more relevant than ever now for our U.S.-based companies in particular. We've got to use them and make the most of them.
Well, thank you, everybody, and these were useful perspectives. I just want to do a quick time check. We have about 35 minutes, and we want to leave around 10 minutes for Q&A at the end for all of this. So I want to be sure that we touch a little bit on how to move forward, and then I want to open it up to the floor. So I'm going to actually ask the panel to keep their remarks relatively brief, because I suspect there are a fair amount of questions on this. Before I turn it back over to the panel, I just wanted to point out something, since Nina's and Meg's students are in the room. There are three issues people should keep in mind with MSIs. Number one, and this is something that colors our ambivalence a lot, is they were never designed to be institutions. They were designed to be transitional entities in hope that regulation would come along. And none of us anticipated some would be around 20 years, because if you're building an institution, you would build it a different way than you would if you didn't think it was going to be permanent. The second thing, and it's come up over and over again, is there is an enormous resource imbalance in participating in them. For a big company, you can always have an employee assigned to it. For an NGO, you can't do it. And so over time, the longer something goes on, the more questions you have to ask yourself about how cost effective is it to participate. And that's a real issue. And then finally, going to those 2 points, look also at how many major NGOs have left their own signature initiatives. Global Witness has left the Kimberley process. Amnesty has left the voluntary principles. People do leave. Oxfam has left initiatives as well, and EITI is in crisis over some of its members. So all of these factors come together in that way. But finally, just also remember that any subsequent standard for companies, whether it's regulation or anything else, is usually based on a foundation of some standard an MSI created. So if there is a kind of long-standing impact on all of them, it is the standards developed there, and where the critiques rightfully are focused are on the implementation and enforcement of them. So these are just some things to keep in mind for your next quiz or paper coming up anytime soon. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Virginia, and we'll go down the road. Just take a couple of minutes to think about how to move forward, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Right, some of the ways we can move forward, I think, are about improving MSIs themselves, which is something that the MSI Integrity tool can be helpful for. I would like to actually, in my very brief amount of time here, actually build on something that some of the things that Bennett ended with, which is the context in which we're thinking about trying to improve MSIs, a context which has changed dramatically. One in which we have a rise in populism and a decline in trust in institutions. So, for instance, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which came out recently, demonstrates a hugely steep plunge in trust in institutions in the United States, oddly enough, a rise in China, and particularly a decline in trust in information. And of course, part of what MSIs are all about is about information, transparency, knowledge about what's going on, the processes that are part of MSIs are information processes in many cases. I also would like to point out that building again on what Bennett said, that the normative context, the environment in which we're in right now is not really that friendly to talking about human rights. And Amnesty International recently came out saying that world leaders are abandoning human rights as an issue. I was going to mention Exxon and Chevron and the EITI, which Bennett did. One note of, that I think is positive, however, some of you may be aware that BlackRock CEO Lawrence Fink came out and told all of his investors that companies must make a positive contribution to society in making the world a better place, given government failure, which gives a potential opening for improving MSIs, establishing new ones, or moving to what we really want. And I think what we really want is better governance. And what we need to do, despite a hesitation to dip our toes into, say, regime change in other countries, which we don't have good experience at, we still want regime change. We really do want to support democracy and human rights protection in governments around the world, and that really is our ultimate, I think, aim, not the construction of MSIs, but construction of better governance on the ground.
Brian?
Thank you. Well, so going forward, I brought something that reflects a position that we already put out. Going forward, I want to point directly at something called the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network, which is recently created. And this is basically sort of the other side of this, that is making sure that workers' voice, as far as the labor kind of MSI, are at the center. And this is an initiative that's very recent, that we support. I brought a list of the organizations also supporting, and I think they define themselves, given the kind of MSIs that dominate all of the world, the spectrum, as Bennett put it, as not an MSI. But as I already said, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has it sometimes said, no, we're just a worker-centered one. So I'm going to leave that here. There's an organizational website, and also those organizations that have signed on since, I think, November. It's pretty new. Going forward, I'd like to say things like the Bangladesh Accord, some people would call an MSI. It was renewed a few months ago. It was negotiated. I think you could call that voluntary. Some people say, no, it can't be voluntary, but it was negotiated. And the workers certainly did not get everything that we wanted in there. It doesn't make any room for freedom of association because the companies, they don't accept that as relevant to the issue. But it has actually helped, in practice, establish workers' groups expressing their rights. And also about the accord, because of this exit, because it has an enforceability aspect, arbitration was used, brought at least one major brand to a negotiation and to a settlement. So these are the kind of initiatives that I think labor can get behind and has gotten clearly behind that. And it really is relevant to the globalization model where you have big brands buying at the top, suppliers all over the world, and the workers or communities. So with this sort of triangular collective bargaining, which is not new, which the jobbers agreements in the United States had, after the Triangle Fire, you had it for 50 or 60 years in the United States before exit, again, the companies left. So I think that that's really important. Another space to really pay attention to is the ILO discussion on global supply chains and decent work. I think a lot of people did follow that 2016 discussion. I haven't, it's not that transparent where it is, but it's supposed to lead to the possibility of a new standard that will be very important to addressing these things. And I would hope that, unlike the US government constantly pointing towards MSIs as the answer, or the National Action Plan of the US government doing so, or the UNGPs themselves pointing toward them, or a lot of procurement efforts just saying, we can't figure this out, call an MSI, without really knowing the effectiveness of the MSI. But that's why this project is important, because people are seeing it as an exit from regulation to another place that wasn't supposed to persist in time, but here they are. So I think that's really important to recognize, and all of what Bennett said about the current administration, absolutely. But beyond that, and even worse than that, in the longer term, I mean, we have to recognize that we're doing this in a world where the Chinese economy, government, and view of human rights is very important to anything that we think we're doing. And I don't understand how you can certify the freedom of association of Chinese workers, yet MSIs do that, and not one or two. So I think the resource imbalance was addressed that I think I already said something about. And I think the other point that Bennett made was important, leaving what you created. I mentioned that, exit, voice, and loyalty. Who feels like something's at stake? Who feels like something's worth staying? There are different reasons to leave. And I think the other point I'd like to make, that the leading to laws and regulation, MSIs, yes, they've done that. In many countries, including this one, collective bargaining agreements have done that for over 100 years. Whether you're talking about New York in the garment sector or Brazil about maternity leave, plenty of times unions have negotiated something with an employer or with the government that later became a law for everyone. So I think this is, something that people lose sight of. There are solutions in the past that we need to use in the future. But in the end, despite all the clear criticism, I think it's clear that we have to, that is, labor has to stay aware of and involved, even if not formally affiliated to these MSIs, because they're spaces that, things are happening we need to know about, move in the right direction, and if they weren't meant to be institutions, that hasn't really stopped them from becoming such. There are relationships there, and there are just spaces where I think that we're going to remain to be a critical voice. I think I'll let it go at that.
Thanks. So I wanna make sure we have enough time,
Yeah.
so I'll just ask
Keep it
everybody to
quick.
go
Okay.
quickly.
Yeah, okay. I started my remarks by saying I'm glass half full. I actually, now I'm thinking, and that the glass has this real potential to teeter off the edge, and this is why.
Positively or negatively?
To spill out. And this is why. I mean, I think that the fundamental crises that sort of Arvind elaborated, including this balance of power within the MSI vis-a-vis companies, vis-a-vis civil society, vis-a-vis government, is a real fundamental challenge to making sure MSIs remain a viable path forward for promoting human rights. The second big issue is a shared interest. I think companies participate in MSIs for completely different reasons than human rights groups do and than governments do, and I don't think we have an honest dialogue about what those interests are. The third is how MSIs are fitting into an increasingly crowded space of regulation, of other initiatives, of industry-specific efforts, where does the MSI situate? The last piece, and I agree with Brian completely, that who gets left out of the conversation? And I think this is important. I think we need to disaggregate MSIs. I think we need to approach these as separate creatures, because the reality is that the MSI is not a thing. It fits to address a particular sector or a specific set of harms. And I think it's hard to sort of elaborate a set of principles that apply to all of them. For instance, again, this shows the difference. In private security, I don't see what a worker voice would have around certification of private security firms. But I fundamentally agree with Brian when it comes to labor-oriented MSIs, that there's a real voice there, because who's the community that's going to be impacted? They're not all the same in certain sectors. So I just think that's what I'm putting out there as where the glass could spill over.
Meg?
Sure. So first off, I want to just acknowledge the good work of MSI Integrity. As Arvind mentioned, when we started out with this long ago, we didn't have these tools. We were building something for around a set of issues and sort of an alchemy that existed among people willing to talk. And so what I think is great about this is we now have an opportunity where we're in the trenches, as Amal and I have been, for example, with the private security industry, to be able to point to an external authority about what is the integrity of this particular process and does it satisfy these points. At the same time, I would say that, as we've acknowledged, these MSIs really were created to respond to particular issues. They weren't necessarily designed to cover a waterfront or to carry all balls simultaneously, and I'm not sure that they can. So that when we apply this, we should be doing it mindful of the fact there is no one size fits all, and that we do have the opportunity to use this flexibly to apply to an initiative on its terms with its mission, but to also ask very critical questions about whether it's meeting its mission. I just wanted to leave 3 last points on the table. The first is that I do think that one of the key roles for MSIs in this space is as a thought leader. These challenges that MSIs address are really difficult, and if anyone thinks that one company or one NGO or one government can solve them, guess again. They're really difficult. They require multi-stakeholder perspectives to sort out. At the recent annual meeting of the Fair Labor Association, we had panels on ethical recruitment that were convened by the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility around their work, and also on fair compensation convened by Oxfam. So bringing in these external voices and experts to talk about the hot topics and inform the membership and other attendees. Similarly, within the Global Network Initiative, a core requirement of its work is policy and advocacy. So once a year, there's a learning forum. There are also ongoing learning dialogues. And as a result of that, it's certainly true to say that the company transparency reporting about government requests was really informed by that engagement within the GNI. Similarly, the telco sustainability reporting has evolved to include issues of freedom of expression and privacy as a result of that thought leadership and engagement. But the second point that I wanted to make, and it's one that I think everybody has touched on here, these issues are getting a lot more complex. They're multifaceted. Take ethical recruitment, for example. The work that's being done now, which is really, really great, recognizes that within a given country or a region, you can't just stick within your industry silo or your NGO. You need all the different sectors at the table. So ag, electronics, manufacturing, et cetera, if you're going to have an effective outcome on ethical recruitment, because those workers hop from sector to sector within a country or within a region. So I do see a value across multi-stakeholder initiatives in joining up together to try to solve those problems, because it creates greater leverage than would be possible in kind of starting again from scratch to go to company by company. And also because, frankly, within that multi-stakeholder initiative, you're going to have leaders and laggards. So it gives you the chance to leverage that. At the same time, I think the biggest challenge and danger I see is one that Amal alluded to, which is that there is this tendency that we see across all these initiatives. Companies and governments that are participating really hate to give up control. And they get kind of brought into these often because of a crisis or some reputational risk, kind of kicking and screaming or dragged into it. And they're there for the stated purpose of addressing that concern. And as I've mentioned, the initiatives do evolve to address other concerns that are part of the, within scope. But the bigger challenge is these issues aren't static. So again, in thinking about, for example, the internet and telco space, there are huge issues looming: artificial intelligence and privacy. Consumer privacy is really still kind of a hairy issue. All of the issues around election tampering. And there's a tendency within the sector to think about, well, we've got this pressure, it's heat from a government, say the European governments, or heat from NGOs or investors, let's solve it. And it gets taken outside of the context of a multi-stakeholder initiative, when in reality, you'd be better off staying within the tent. So I think that's a real tension. We see that with the private security industry because we have a tension between the external work of these commercial certification standards and what level of credibility they can carry versus our bigger challenge of monitoring them on the ground and ensuring remedy. And that brings me to my last point, which is Bennett is exactly right, that at their root, right now, one of the biggest roles that they can play is giving CSOs a seat at the table and a safe space for dialogue with these big players around the issues that confront them where governments are absent or unwilling to talk. So that's both in terms of the convening power that they provide and all of the functions that they serve and the way in which NGO voices get incorporated into that. I've alluded to that previously, but it's also in filling a remedy gap. I do not mean to suggest that they are the answer. They are not. But in the context of the FLA, for example, the third-party complaint function has played a really key role. The unions utilize it heavily, particularly in Central America. Within the Global Network Initiative and the ICOCA, because they're younger, they focus principally on ensuring that the company members have UNGP-compliant grievance mechanisms. And in fact, the GNI changed its implementation guidelines a year ago to require exactly that. The ICOCA within the past 6 months issued detailed guidance for companies, and we've had an ongoing engagement with them to sensitize them to the fact that you can't just dole out money and checks. That's not what remedy means. That's not what remedy is about. So I do see a role for multi-stakeholder initiatives and also filling that space more effectively, both strengthening company mechanisms, but also working to provide their own. And although GNI and ICOCA are early to that process for their own initiative, at least working with companies is a good place to start.
Quick, yeah. 3 quick points: unions, law, and trust. So unions, Arvind will remember that over the objections of a couple of the U.S. oil companies in the spring of 2000, I brought in the International Confederation of Chemical, Oil, and Atomic Workers, I think, Ken Zinn, that group.
ICEM.
Yeah, they left a few years after. They should come back. The single worst incident in the world related to the issues that the voluntary principles address was back in the news in the last week in conjunction with the presidential transition in South Africa, sadly, because the new president of South Africa, who has done a world of good for his country, nonetheless was, some think, was complicit in the deaths of 35 striking mine workers at Lonmin back in 2014, I think it was. I mean, the worst event involving security forces in the extractive industry, I think, ever, the worst single event. I wish Lonmin were somehow in the government of South Africa, but we need to get unions. We need to get unions back into VPs, and something I probably shouldn't broadcast because it's something we have to discuss within GNI, but I have started a discussion with the leadership of the International Confederation of Trade Unions about joining GNI as observers. I think the connection between freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, right to privacy is absolutely essential to the present and future of trade union organizing around the world, and we need to find a way to engage them. Second point is on law and regulation. One of my biggest regrets ever was calling the voluntary principles in security and human rights voluntary. And I think that name set them back half a decade. But to set the record straight and to make the broader point, as early as 2002, the VPs were legally binding, as they remain to this day, to this minute, in certain project-level contracts, initially beginning with the leader in the VPs among all the companies that did more than just about every oil company in the world put together in the 2000s, namely BP, a company that has been accursed by many, and not for understandable reasons, since Deepwater Horizon. They did that not just in Indonesia with the Tangguh project, they did it in Baku Ceyhan, and other companies, Shell among them, have followed suit. The voluntary principles are not voluntary, they are legally binding in many project contexts around the world. And it goes to the point Virginia made that these voluntary, so-called voluntary multi-stakeholder standards do evolve, and some take on different forms, and there's nothing more serious than a legally, contractually binding provision as they are. There's whole models now of what the VPs look like as legally binding instruments that are used by companies around the world. Look, we never intended that any of these were going to be long-term, and that, goes to my point, and Arvind picked up on this as well, that look, at the end of the day, we need legislation, we need regulation, but we got to work with where we are in the current domestic political and geopolitical moment. I already made that point. My third and final ending point here is on trust, and I really like the way that Virginia picked up on my earlier comments and cited the Edelman Trust Barometer. We do some real good in these MSIs by collaboratively coming up with these norms and standards, by having honest dialogues, sometimes having serious problems and conflicts, but having those discussions. And they happen largely in MSIs, but not just in MSIs. The Bangladesh Accord's a wonderful example. Another example where different stakeholders have come together, and Brian and I are in the middle of it together with Judy Gerhardt in the audience, is the Uzbek cotton campaign. For 10 years now, we have had major global apparel brands, apparel trade associations, responsible investors, NGOs, and trade unions all working towards the goal, and we now see light at the end of the tunnel of ending forced labor in the cotton industry in Uzbekistan. We have built trust among all those stakeholders, and it's not hard to put together NGOs and SRIs and trade unions, but to bring together and keep together the brands and the trade associations over the years does a huge amount of good. I see my friend Carlos Busquets here, who's been with EICC now, responsible responsible business alliance, and they too do a good job in this regard of trying to build trust. So we need trust. We have the biggest deficit of trust now in American politics in certainly my lifetime, and we need these MSIs in miniature to try to rebuild and refine and extend that trust where we can in the absence of the good regulation that we're going to have, the good legislation, at least for another few years. And that doesn't mean we don't do what we have to do in November and 2 Novembers after that. But in the meantime, let's work with what we've got. These MSIs are among our tools.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to quickly open it up to the floor, and I'm going to call on Judy right away because I saw her earlier. So if you'll just identify yourself and who you represent or where you're from, and then go for it.
Thank you, Arvind. Judy Gerhardt, the Director of the International Labor Rights Forum, ILFs, out the FLA, I spent 13 years at SAI, so I have quite a lot of opinions, but fortunately, Arvind referenced a lot of the points that I had hoped to make, so I'm going to boil this down to a question, which is, what is the intention of MSI Integrity to revise this? Because Brian opened with the statement that it needed to be revised. Just flipping through the pages as I sit here in the audience, I can see a few things that are glaringly problematic. And I'll just list two really quickly. One is on the accountability. It doesn't even reference the idea of leading to legally binding. It's not even an issue. And the second one is transparency. It doesn't lead to anything impact-oriented. The problem is, I think, I'm absolutely glass half full, if not more. That's not the point. I love your tipping one. That's a good one. That's why we've been with the leader a long time. But these things are only 20 years old. I come into this 30 years ago when we were trying to get RCA Victor to uphold Mexican law the way they would have upheld U.S. law. That was, the first struggle with legalization, for at least in my lifetime. These MSIs, 20 years, let's not keep our imagination so finite. I think that the conversation here is leading a lot to tweaking, and we need to be restructuring. So, restructuring and leading to the revision of the MSI Integrity to not have this stop that innovation and not just tweaks, but much deeper innovation that is happening. If you look at the Bangladesh Accord or the CIW or these other places where I think there are certain pushes to go well beyond the imagination of the MSIs at this time. The MSIs want to stay current. They need to think about local restructuring, and I hope MSI Integrity will help them lead in that direction. So that's by way of commentary and question as to, can you give me some hope there about that?
Yeah, do you guys?
Yeah, I can jump in. We are absolutely committed to
So my first request as a revision would be find a new term other than MSI and see what happens. But I will open it up to the floor. Are there any other questions from the room?
Who has the question?
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Kubik Nighting from Oxfam. We've been, of course, involved in many MSIs over the years. And although, like everybody else, consider myself a glass half full guy, I think there's one aspect that's not treated maybe as consequently, which is the divisive effect that MSIs have had on civil society. And I think that is something that if you look, no matter what the experience of the apparel industry or around certification in agriculture or around chemical process, like the disagreement between civil society organizations on what to do with MSIs has been, I would argue, an unintended, maybe an intended consequence of these initiatives that I think has been quite the high cost that's been very much by Anyway, I'm just, I rarely hear this kind of topic being mentioned, but it's more a problem than a question. My question, and just real quick, is I feel like we know right now, thanks to the work of MSI Integrity and others, about what's a good MSI design supposed to be. But I'm wondering if we know more about what are the scope conditions that would allow that an effective design to be. Like in what sectors do we think this design is more likely to happen? Around what issues do we think an effective MSI can more likely evolve? And I'm wondering if it's a more research question, a question for the panel, but I'm curious if we can start thinking about what are the facilitating factors that will allow us to have effective.
Any thoughts?
Can I just get in on the civil society? And I think Brian kind of mentioned this at the beginning of his remarks too. I mean, this is something that I see as a civil society member of one of the MSIs, with groups like Oxfam and Amnesty sort of disappearing from a lot of these MSIs, is who's left. And then also which organizations are created to fill the gaps. So the reality is accountability-focused organizations do not play an active role in MSIs. So what you have then are sort of implementation-focused NGOs. The voluntary principles is a perfect example where the entire cadre of NGO, largely I'd say, is implementation focused. So therefore, how do you even have a semblance of accountability in the initiative? That said, I feel like this supports your point about the schisms that it creates within civil society, because we have been very critical of the fact that there's no accountability-focused NGOs within that. So I think it's important, though, that we have some honest conversation within civil society about who is representing which interests, and then be able to say that some aren't good enough.
So I'd like to add to that point, because I agree with them all. We've really struggled with this, and it is, you also know through Oxfam's own engagement, it has just really riven a number of these initiatives and made it utterly impossible to have an accountability-oriented voice. The VPs are a good example of that. And we see it also on the ground. When we went out to do field-based monitoring of the ICOCA in these various countries, we were trialing this, we convened civil society groups, and we had a whole range of them participating, and a chunk of them were looking for funding from the companies or from the governments, and so that's fine, but it has nothing to do with promoting accountability. And so I'm always right. I mean, there's a misunderstanding about what we're doing, but there's also some real challenges in terms of identifying and engaging in an appropriate way the groups that share the goals of the initiative and can be engaged appropriate to their abilities, interests, and the other objectives that they have, because we don't want to consume their efforts as we have when we try to engage them. They're doing really good work. We want to promote and strengthen that, find a way to also use their expertise to strengthen the work that we do. That is really, really hard. And I think part of it is that, again, in the private security context, we've looked for interlocutors, particularly in the humanitarian assistance space or the UN space. We've got missions on the ground, groups that have a slightly different orientation, but that is really, it's still challenging to identify and build that up. It doesn't really exist for a lot of these issues. We have the same problem within the GNI. We do an assessment based on cases, and then we have to go out and try to identify cases that can be used to interrogate company policies. It's really, really hard. to go out and work with groups on the ground and identify what might be appropriate, get enough information, work it into a shape that can then be given to an assessor to interrogate a company. So I'm not suggesting that, it's entirely the fault of the MSIs, it's just that there are still some pieces missing. The last thing I'll say is that I really do think that one of the biggest challenges here is foundations have not valued this work adequately. There is zero support for this, not only here, but in these countries where it could really matter, both in building capacity of NGOs, because that really is not something an MSI can or should do directly. Some of it they can do, but a lot should be done by third parties, and also in identifying and empowering those groups to engage appropriately on their terms with these initiatives. We really need to see more of that, and until we do, I think it's going to be very challenging to elevate that voice, identify it, and work with it. I've mentioned the ways MSIs do that, but they could use a lot more support.
Let me just come in on what Meg just said. This thing about the foundation support, this is incredibly important. And it's missing, we have this problem, I'll just say it, with G&I in particular right now, where we're frankly overly reliant on company funding to the point where I begin to wonder and worry about maintaining our integrity as an MSI. There has to be diversified funding between companies, governments, and foundations. The thing about getting the accountability MSIs to the table, if they're not there, it's not really an MSI in my view. At least Human Rights Watch is still in the voluntary principles. I want to see Oxfam and Amnesty back in. You come back in, you will improve it, period, and you'll be welcomed with open arms. And I'd like to see NGOs active in unions in the FLA. There's a lot of room for improvement, but show me a so-called MSI without accountability NGOs, and I'll show you an organization that really isn't an MSI. It's all about accountability. Not all about accountability, there's a lot more, but accountability is the fundamental cornerstone that give these credibility and impact.
I want to add something quickly on the issue of sort of a enabling environment for that architecture that is being prescribed. What would it look like? I mean, last week there was a State Department DRL activity about the business role and business and human rights, and a woman from a Colombian YU indigenous community was there, and pretty much the first thing that she talked about was the impact of company business and human rights programs to divide, to co-opt, to create who they want to interact with. And a lot of this has to do, and freedom of association isn't just for unions. It has to do with not understanding, a group's right, any group's right, workers' rights to create or join an organization that they chose, not that the company or the government chose. And hers, she had anecdotes that she went into later. The same part of Colombia she was from, we had explicit experience in the oil sector with Pacific Rubiales. They got certified by something called Equitable Origins. Equitable Origins said, we proactively supported Trade Union X. And the company said that. And their Price Waterhouse was the social audit operation for Equitable Origins. So there's a supply chain of Equitable Origins, Price Waterhouse, the audit happens, and the company says, we supported this union. Well, there was another union there. The union was there before. It had 90% of the workers, but they proactively supported a union. For them, that's good enough. That means they're respecting freedom of association. So I think without understanding freedom of association, whether it's labor or community or environment or whatever the issue, the woman from the indigenous community was talking a lot about women's rights as well. I think there's this sort of deafness about the idea that it's not that simple. It's not a tick-a-box type issue. And lastly, I had in my notes, I didn't get to it. I think we would need another session to talk about the future of work, the future of the workplace, because all of this is going to get a lot more complicated very quickly. The whole idea of the employment relationship and dislocation of all kinds of work is only in everyone's future. So start working immediately on the next iteration, thinking about the future of work, because things are moving quickly. And I can't say any more about that.
So we're 10 minutes over, and nobody's leaving. So I don't know if that's a sign that the panelists have time, or we have the room or not. If not, because I mean, if there are more questions and nobody seems to be moving, why not ask them?
Because we see it, you have to go.
Yeah.
So we don't want anyone to feel like they're.
All right. I mean, maybe we can take one more question if anybody has it, and if people need to walk out, feel free to walk out as well. All right, cool.
Can I make one quick
Sure,
point
sure.
though? I mean, I think actually, Uwe, your provocation at the end is, I think, where all of us need to be going. And in fact, if there's a future iteration of this type of convening or a smaller meeting, I would love to talk about what are perfect examples of where an MSI could be built and what conditions would we put in on those? Which sectors, what types of harms? Because I think we need to constantly think about, as Judy said too, like what does reinvention look like around MSIs instead of just tinkering at the wheels? So
The only other thing I'll add to that, and I
should
always
do
hate
that.
to put the last word on Arvind, is that we're all working toward the same goals. We may disagree about how we get there, but we are working toward the same goals. And so there still is opportunity, despite our differences, to find ways we can work together. We really are in a dogfight here. And I mentioned a couple of examples, but I am optimistic, particularly as these challenges get more complex, that we can also find ways to combine forces and work together where possible. As I mentioned, some of the advocacy around wages that we've done with the AFL and otherwise, but there are good examples. The VPs and ICOCA finding shared purpose. So I'm optimistic that apart from, fixing the foundation, there are opportunistic ways we can find to work together, and we should really be prioritizing that.
Great. With that, thank you, everybody. Thank you to SICE and MSI Integrity. And thanks to all the panelists as well.
Everybody, and thank you to the International Law Department, with the chair and the department, for letting MSI Integrity come in and show this new tool, and we can improve it.
Am I go get
I know, they're so good though. We have like 12 in our office. Yeah.
We
put 'em
just
out on
moved
our-
offices.
Good.
I moved down.
Oh, same building.
No, same
Okay,
building.
yeah.
Please.
Right here.
Yeah, I know. My
Yeah,
God.
things are bad.
When that building goes,
We're in 7th floor.
Oh, so you guys are moved down to what floor now? 7.